Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. This is the Center for Fostering Success, Best Practice, Best Fit webinar series. And so again, I just want to welcome everybody for joining us, and then I'm going to go ahead and move into our next steps. So the first thing is that I'm your host. My name is Bree Simmons. I'm the FSM Ambassador, as well as the CETA Scholar at Western Michigan University. And I'm super excited to be hosting today. Next, I would just like to do a quick shout out and thank you to our funders, Western Michigan University, the Havermill Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation for the continuous support of everything that Fostering Success Michigan does. And then next, I would like to introduce our guest today. Her name is Lisa Phoenix, and she has a PhD. She's working at Portland Community College Fostering Success Coordinator. And then I'm just going to read her bio and tell you a little bit about her. So Lisa Phoenix is a former foster youth who graduated with a PhD in neurobiology and behavior from the University of Washington in 1998. For a number of years, Dr. Phoenix worked as both a scientist and an educator at biomedical research institutions and universities in the United States and abroad, including the Scripps Research Institute, the Southwest Foundation for Biomedical Research, the University of Aruba, and the University of Michigan Flint. She now coaches students with lived experience in foster care towards college success at Portland Community College and advocates both locally and nationally for programs that support their education goals. In her spare time, Dr. Phoenix gives inspirational talks about her life, which she detailed in her book, Alternate Ending, an inspirational true story about beating the odds. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Lisa Phoenix. Hi.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. So our presentation today is on promoting resiliency, understanding the intersection between self-awareness and self-compassion. I'd like to start with a caveat. Many of you who are listening today probably know the concepts presented here from a particular theoretical perspective and have standard terms for your field that may be interchangeable for the ones I'm going to use here. Because I'm hoping you will take this information and make it applicable to you, I have intentionally tried to make it more accessible by avoiding as much scientific jargon as possible. So as you go through again, from your perspective, there may be some other terms you would use, but we really want to make this as accessible as possible. So I'm having a slide, hold on, let's see. My slides are not advancing. Let's see if I can do this again. Okay. So we have some learning objectives here today. One is to gain a deeper understanding into ourselves, learn about common forms of cognitive distortions and how they play in student interactions, and become aware of signs that self-care is needed, and also to understand self-compassion as a tool to promote resilience. If there's anything you can take home from this webinar today, it's really that focus on self-compassion. I love this quote, and I think it's so important in the work that we do. The highest result of education is tolerance. I love Helen Keller. She was really brilliant in so much of what she was able to contribute, and her thoughtfulness here, I think, is important for all of us. Not only are we really here to sort of be tolerant to help the development of other individuals, but we need to be tolerant of ourselves. So if we're in education, this tolerance applies to us as well as others. I'm going to start out talking about intrapersonal skills. Some of you may know this term already. Interpersonal skills are skills that provide a moral and psychological grounding to enable an individual to act with integrity and consistency in any situation. So this is just one definition of it. And this is so important in the work that we do. Interpersonal skills are the cornerstone of supporting students with a history in foster care. We may have been learned about or have been taught interpersonal skills in the classroom. We may teach them to others, but it's really the ongoing application in our own lives that requires intentional self-reflection and willingness to receive constructive feedback in areas where we may be lacking insight into our own behaviors that are key to really being able to engage and develop our intrapersonal skills. So throughout this webinar, you're going to be asked to do a bit of self-reflection. And so we know that intrapersonal skills help us act with consistency and integrity. So I'd like you to take a moment to think about what is your ability? So ask yourself this question: my ability to act with consistency and integrity in my work is impacted by. So in my particular case, there are lots of things that impact my ability to work with consistency and integrity. Some of them are quite obvious, such as fatigue, right? Hunger. If I have an unbalanced workload, if my mental health is not in a good space. But there are more subtle things that impact my ability to work with consistency and integrity. And we're going to talk about some of those. And those are really things that are internal to me and the way in which I process the world. So take a moment and jot a few of those down. Okay, so one big one that we often have difficulty sort of paying as much attention to in our lives as we should is mental health. And those in supportive roles, even if they have extensive education and training, are not immune to mental health challenges. Whether mental health problems are undiagnosed or have been clinically explored, they impact the work that we do with students. You know, this seems so obvious when we put it out there and it's written in a paragraph, but as individuals who are really in supportive roles, we are sometimes terrible at recognizing and doing what we need to support our own mental health. Working with integrity and consistency requires that we admit and care for our own mental health needs. I have mental health needs. I can openly say that I have seasonal affective disorder. It's very hard for me in the winter. There are things that I absolutely have to do around that in order to make sure that I show up with integrity and consistency every day that I do this job. So there's lots of research out there, so much research out there, really looking at the mental health challenges of those in the helping professions. Terms like compassion fatigue, right? Vicarious trauma, they show up a lot. I'm sort of talking about how the challenges of the work can influence our mental health. But additionally, you know, we have our own struggles. Many of us have our own struggles regardless of the work. And so part of what we have to do is we have to be able to openly own those. So research surveying counseling psychologists, and again, there's many studies out there. So this is a wide range, you know, anywhere from 50 to 80+% of individuals who work as psychologists, as social workers, have indicated suffering at least one episode of clinical depression. So one study here that I'm presenting is 62%. In addition, 51% of respondents indicated challenges that impacted their professional functioning. And so this was from an American Psychological Association survey in 2010, right? So it impacts what we do. And many perceive barriers to seeking support, including a lack of time and minimization or denial of issues. So if you think about that, so you're being impacted, 50% of us are being impacted in some way by a mental health challenge, and we say lack of time is one of the reasons we don't do anything about it, or that it's not as big of a problem as it really is. So this is really something we need to own our own awareness around. And why is it important? Well, it's really because we are, again, in that role. So, you know, we're asking our students to be aware of their particular issues and challenges, and we're going to talk about some of those. And their mental health, right? We're giving them support around their mental health. We're walking them over to get the right people and the right resources. But what are we doing for ourselves? So if I show up to work and I'm depressed and I have no energy and I have a black outlook on the world, certainly that influences my interaction with that student. So our supportive interactions are improved. So even if we cannot care for, engage in self-care for ourselves. If, you know, and we're going to talk about how sometimes we don't feel worthy of the same things we feel our students are worthy of. If we can't, we should at least do it for our students, okay? So I think we all need to own that we're just as valuable and we need just as much as our students do. But if what you need to do is get support by thinking about your students, that's another way to sort of take this forward. So let's talk a little bit about trauma, right? So we're supporting students who have experienced trauma. There's no set definition of trauma out there, but I in particular view trauma in this way. Trauma is a deeply disturbing or distressful experience or set of experiences commonly involving physical and/or emotional harm that activates the stress response and produces lasting adverse effects on an individual's sense of well-being. Trauma can be primary, meaning it happened to you. It can be complex, where there are multiple chronic or prolonged developmentally adverse events. So not all foster youth will have complex trauma, but many will. It can be secondary. It happened to someone else, but you witnessed or heard graphic details that activated your stress response and caused distress. An example would be exposure to domestic violence in the home, right? So if you see that, you're not the target of the violence, but that's enough to activate your stress response. It's the same thing in working with our students, right? Sometimes we are given lots of graphic details that may trigger our own primary trauma, or just the detail and the incredible darkness in some of those experiences activates our own stress response. Trauma can also be re-triggered by encountering associated stimuli or focusing on memories of the event. And we're going to talk a little bit about memories today. So one thing that we have to remember when we're thinking about the impact of trauma is we have to have a little bit of understanding of perceptual processing. So, you know, my field is neurobiology, and so I know a lot about how information comes in and becomes a perception of the environment. So, you know, our sensory receptors, our, you know, auditory, our visual receptors, our taste, all of these things are sending information up from the body into the brain, right? And that becomes a perception only after
Lisa, I'm not sure if you can hear us or not, but we're having a little bit of sound problem.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay. Is it going in and out?
No, now it's good.
Okay, my apologies. Do I need to go back? Was it for a long time? Are we missing material?
No, just this slide, just the beginning of this slide.
Uh-oh, did we lose you again? For those of you listening, I know that Lisa is in Portland and they're experiencing a snowstorm right now, so that might be part of it.
Yeah, we may experience this throughout, so my apologies. So basically, we're just trying to get everyone to understand that when we talk about trauma influences the way in which we process information. So perceptions come in from our sensory receptors, such as our auditory receptors, right? Our visual receptors, our taste receptors. That information is being brought up into the brain, and there in the brain, it's organized to create basically a sensation. And this is referred to as top-down processing. Our developmental and cultural experiences influence how we top-down process. And much of the time, top-down processing is going on without our conscious awareness. So the brain wants to make shortcuts, and many of the ways in which it makes shortcuts are to basically make sure that we are safe and that we make quick decisions in order to avoid experiences that may be harmful. So if you've had a lot of harmful experiences, it's going to influence the way that you top-down process, right? So this is important to understand. It's not easy to change top-down processing. I have lost slide control, I think. Okay. So if you've experienced extreme or complex trauma, especially developmental trauma, you are primed for survival. And so you will be someone that expects bad things to happen. And this occurs both physiologically and cognitively, right? So it's our thinking patterns as well as how reactive our physiological state is. This can lead to errors in processing perceptual experiences and non-adaptive thinking patterns, such as cognitive distortion. Cognitive distortion is a tendency to engage thoughts, which are usually negative, that are inaccurate and do not reflect reality for the given context, right? So one thing we have to remember, in certain contexts, it wouldn't be a distortion, right? So if you are in a violent household, your perception that it is unsafe and that the people are unsafe and shouldn't be trusted, that's normal for that context. But when you move into the context of the work environment, the school environment, right, this is when it becomes inaccurate, right? Because that's not what's happening in that environment. These distortions can lead to misunderstandings and maladaptive behavior, right? So having a distorted belief that others cannot be trusted, it's going to do some things, right? So one is it's going to make you interpret things like neutral facial cues as negative or threatening. If someone has experienced trauma, this style of thinking can happen almost automatically as a survival tool. I don't like to use the word maladaptive or pathological because, again, it comes out of certain environments. It made sense in that environment. So it's a survival tool, and it becomes non-adaptive in a new environment. So let's talk about some common types of cognitive distortion. And as we go through these, we all have life experiences. And whether we were put into foster care or not, many of us have various forms of trauma, some of those developmentally, some of those as we move into adulthood, and all of us are capable of cognitive distortion. So I don't have time today to go over all of the forms of cognitive distortion that we engage in. I'm just going to go over some common ones that I see in the students that I support and also in those that support students. So we're going to go over those, but there are many out there. So one that I see very commonly in students and their supporters is the fallacy of change distortion. This thought process may lead us, and again, we're trying to focus on us today, to believe others will change to suit our expectations if we pressure or beg them to do so, right? So we put, our job is to support and get our students, in a sense, to support them, to empower them to change. But sometimes we take on a lot of ownership for that, maybe too much, right? We think that our happiness or worth is at stake if we do not get them to change, meaning we focus on them instead of ourselves to feel complete and fulfilled. In relationships, this kind of distortion is often the basis of something called codependency. Okay, so again, we're really looking to change another person, and we sort of get our sense of self or self-worth or self-esteem tied up in that. So throughout this webinar, I've really tried to talk to individuals, and a lot of individuals, I do a lot of training, so they come to me to help them with particular issues. And so these are common things that I hear. Sometimes when I'll be working with a student to get through a big challenge, and then they disappear. I'll try connecting again, but I usually never get a response. My tendency is to reach out over and over because I care and I worry about them. It's important that I figure out how to help. I feel like I've failed at my job when I can't help teach students to overcome their challenges, okay? So one thing that we have to understand here is that we can't change anyone, right? It's up to the individual to change. And so when students have had very challenging backgrounds or facing big challenges in their life right now, some of which we could never imagine, sometimes we take on too much ownership for that. And we think that our responsibility is to fix it. But it's the student, right? The student has to be empowered to take control and fix it for themselves. And if the student does not, we can't own that, right? We can't own that, but often we do. So we have to be aware of this tendency to get caught up in what's happening with our students. Another one is polarized thinking. So we see this a lot in students, right? And it's, again, these cognitive processing sort of habits that we take on, they're really important in certain types of situations. So I have to make a quick decision, right? Good or bad? Are these people good or bad? I don't have time to sort of have nuance in there if it's an abusive environment. But black and white thinking is something we all sometimes engage in. And this is a tendency to see ourselves, and again, or others in extreme ways. We may use descriptors that are overly negative, such as terrible, hopeless, failure, right? Or it may just be wonderful, perfect, good, right? So there's no middle ground, and it's either all bad or all good. This shows up when working with students, and particularly if a student is difficult. I have a few students that really frustrate me. It's hard not to view them negatively. There are situations where I see their choices and I think that they're never going to get it together. Seriously, there is no way in my mind they are going to get through school. They're not willing to work, they're rude, and they don't appreciate everything I do to support them. I'm really hard on myself to be productive, and I want them to be too. So this is something we have to think about in terms of what are we doing to ourselves. So many of us put incredible pressure on ourselves to show up every day and be perfect. And in that space of trying to show up every day and be perfect, that harshness that we engage in on ourselves is also a harshness that will show up in how we view our students. So again, we're getting triggered by their particular habits, their behaviors, maybe some of the ways in which they respond to us, and we can quickly put those students into a kind of hopeless category. But we have to remember that life is more nuanced than that. And you know, I can say from my own experience, no one would have ever thought I would go on to be who I am today. And so sometimes it's just a time lag, right? It's a time lag. So if we're really working with a student and we're viewing them from a negative lens, that's really going to impact how well we do our job. So we have to be aware of polarized thinking. And I would encourage you to look at how negatively you view yourself. What is the polarized way in which you put a lens on the work that you do or who you are, and how can you change that up? Another one is catastrophizing. So the worst possible thing is going to happen. Our students do this, and it's understandable given their history. If you've had many bad things happen to you, it's easy to look out into the world and see and expect many more bad things to happen to you, and terrible things, the worst possible things. And this type of lens uses magnifying. So you might, again, make a minor or insignificant event very large, or minimizing, downplaying the magnitude of significant or positive events, right? So again, sort of latching on to the thing that supports this negative filter that you're wearing. It's so hard to help students with some of their problems. Like if a student is having fiscal problems and can't pay rent, if I don't help them, no one else will. Where will they go if they lose their place? On the streets, that's what will happen. People act like there are options out there, but there are no options. It's so horrible. So, you know, we can get overwhelmed with how we're trying to support these students. And yes, indeed, there is sometimes a challenge around resources that these students are facing. And if we're there to support them, we also may be filling that lack of resources out there. But we have to be realistic that it may not happen that someone ends up homeless simply because they're having a fiscal problem. It may not happen that if they can't get a dorm that particular term, that they're going to end up having nowhere else to go. So we have to be careful about how we sort of look at these experiences. And, you know, there are other people to support. There are resources that may be hard and difficult. And even in the worst case scenario that a student has to couch surf, for example, that doesn't mean that's how it's always going to be. And so we have to stay in that space in which we're not constantly catastrophizing, and we're helping ourselves and the student look out into the world and see the positive. Filtering. We ignore the positive while focusing on a single or a few negative details. An example would be ignoring all the good things a boss discussed in a performance report while focusing on the one comment that needs improvement. For those of you who teach, you may notice this sometimes when you read your evaluations. You have tons of positive remarks, but it's that one comment that was negative that you focus all of your energy to. We often use filtering to justify and bolster our catastrophizing, right? So we're in this state, we're looking at the world in a really negative way. We think the worst thing is going to happen. So we're trying to then confirm, right? Confirm, looking out and finding all the details that would justify our thinking that way. So again, this impacts the work that we do with our students. I was working with a student on a scholarship application. She had thoughtfully completed her essay, but when she came to my office to do her submission online, she started texting a friend. I mentioned it to her as an issue. My concern didn't seem to matter. She just kept texting while she made her submission on my computer. I felt so frustrated that she made texting a priority when I was trying to help her. It will be a surprise if she gets a scholarship. Okay, so we're focusing on the texting here, but we're not looking at, right? This individual is not looking at that. What did the student do well, right? What was happening that went well? One, she had thoughtfully completed her essay. She showed up with a completed essay. That was a big one to begin with. She still made the submission. So yes, we may need to raise insight around behaviors related to professionalism, but if we are not careful, we're really going to move it back into this polarized thinking if we focus on only the negative aspect of that interaction. So sometimes even for ourselves, we have to remember what went well in our student interactions and not filter just the negative, but to overall look at the positive. And that's also in our lives, right? In our work. Yes, there are going to be days in which there's going to be a few negative things that happen, but we have to remind ourselves of all the things that we did well, all of the things that went well. And this is our last distortion that we're going to talk about in detail. So control fallacies, right? So the fallacy of external control may lead us or others to feel like we are helpless victims of fate with no power to change what happens to us. So many young individuals coming out of the foster care system really have this particular cognitive distortion at play, right? They feel powerless. And that makes sense, right? They were powerless, right? Courts decided, all kinds of stuff happened and they didn't have any control over that. But as we move into adulthood, we're supporting those students to move away from this particular distortion and to understand how much power they do have to change their fate. We, however, as supporters often suffer from the fallacy of internal control, and it may make us believe that we are responsible for everything that happens, including the emotions and happiness of others. This is one I hear very often when I'm doing training. I don't feel like I can end an appointment with a student who is crying. My worry is they might harm themselves if I don't help them feel better. often I'm the only resource they have for finding emotional support. I know that I can make them feel better. Sometimes, though, a student will take up so much time, I can't help other students, right? So there's some, again, distortion going on here. Ultimately, the individual is responsible for their emotions, right? So yes, we can play a supportive role, but if someone is crying, what they may be needing is some support around how do they empower their internal resources to manage their emotions? How do we connect them if we truly believe that they're going to engage in self-harm? How do we connect them to someone else? How do we set boundaries at the start of every appointment with our students to say to them, I only have 15 minutes today, and no matter what happens, right? We've told the student we're preparing them for that. And even with a student who's very emotional, we might step out, give them a few minutes to sort of empower some of that ability to manage their own emotions, and then come back and say, I have to help another student. If we really feel like there's a critical case here where they need additional support, we might walk them over to the counseling office, for example. But we have to understand that we don't make them feel better, right? The student is responsible for making themselves feel better. And so really this is a space where we have to understand what are good boundaries, how do we employ them with compassion? And it's the same thing for ourselves, right? If we take, again, right, we have to understand that we're not responsible for how everybody else feels, no matter even if they're trying to put it on us, that we're responsible for how they feel. Okay, there are a bunch of other distortions. And again, you can kind of do some research on your own about different forms of cognitive distortions. But, you know, blaming, fallacy of fairness, overgeneralization, jumping to conclusions. You know, I see this one a lot in students. And sometimes I feel this way in my own job when I'm dealing with how administration manages things, right? It was intentional. I know they did it on purpose. Most of the time, people are not doing anything to you on purpose, right? So personalization, I know they didn't come because of me. The shoulds, they shouldn't do that, or they should do that, right? So again, this kind of often ties into those fallacies of control, right? So we have these rigid applications of how we think it should be and how others should live our lives, or live their lives, or how we should live our lives. And we can be quite rigid, right? Global labeling, right? So if there's been a mistake, how do we take that in? I'm a total loser. Always being right. I don't care what they say. I know I'm right. So, you know, be thinking about how do these show up in your world, right? Are there ways in which they are impacting you personally and professionally? Another one we want to talk about is triggers. Triggers occurs when a memory, sight, or sound or smell reminds us of a primary or secondary trauma. Triggers can move us into a highly reactive state in which we engage a survival skill such as fight, flight, or freeze. But also triggers, reactions to a trigger can be more subtle. And so again, cognitive distortion can definitely be in response to a trigger, zoning out, exhaustion, etc. So thinking about triggers, we really, again, what do we bring into our work environment? So here's one trigger I have, I must be aware of when working with students is my visceral aversion to manic behaviors. Since I was raised in a home with a parent with bipolar disorder, I can become quickly exhausted by a student that will not sit down or has pressure of speech, especially if they are expressing agitation. I find myself wanting to disengage, or sometimes I listen without actually hearing what they are saying, right? So again, bringing this back to us, what are our triggers? What are things that we know that bring us into a space where we cannot be there with consistency and integrity, being fully present, right, and ready to engage, basically a compassionate approach to empowering our students. So another self-reflection for you. Where I've had strong feelings or reactions in the moment that seem disproportionate for the situation, I am able to identify these triggers I need to be aware of. Right? Awareness is the key here. So when we have just things, especially things that seem disproportionate, right? A student is late for an appointment and we become disproportionately angry, right? There might be something else going on for us, right? We are being triggered into a highly reactive emotional state. What is that about? Why is that happening, right? So that's, again, more about us than it is about the student. I may need to raise some insight around professional behavior with that student, but the fact that I'm feeling incredibly angry says that I have something in there that I need to work on, and it's going to impact my interactions with students. So take a moment to think about some of the triggers that you've noticed showing up. Okay. So there are lots of different ways trauma can show up, right? And so we need to, in our work, be aware of the way that not only is it showing up for our students, but how is it showing up for us. This is something I've created. There's a lot of work out here, and this is not exhaustive. I've just put in some that I see happening both in my students and in colleagues who are doing this work on a pretty frequent basis. One thing I don't have in here is basically the chasing of success or work, right? When we become our work becomes everything. So this is another way in which when we spend all of our energy and time in our profession, sometimes this is another way that trauma is showing up, right? So our self-worth. So I don't have that here, but let's talk about some of the other stuff. So we know that with our students that trauma, and again, this might be primary or secondary trauma, that our capacity for connection, our ability to be around and interact others and have relationships with others, our attunement to the self, right? Our ability to notice how does our body feel, our ability to engage awareness of both physical sensations and emotional sensations, our ability to trust others, right? To believe that there are other people in our environment are good people, positive people, and to trust them. Our autonomy, right? Whether we are engaging in being overly independent, right? Overly independent, never asking for help, or we're moving to the other position in which we don't feel strong in ourselves. We don't trust ourselves. And so we're asking others to take on things that we're quite capable of, right? So autonomy can be impacted the way in which we show up in the world. Also, our relationships, right? Our capacity to sort of engage in loving interactions with others, our sexuality, right? Trauma can show up and it can compromise all of those aspects of the self, right? In addition, there's more subtle things that can show up. So are we feeling a lot of excessive guilt, right? This is another way trauma can show up. Are we minimizing things that are going on, right? So again, being in that denial space. A loss of creativity. You may see this when you're really starting to feel pressures and unhappy with things that are happening or overwhelmed by the work that you're doing. Suddenly the things you used to love doing, you're sewing, you're painting, your flower arranging, your gardening, all that begins to drop off. Avoidance, right? So avoiding others, not engaging in those things that we used to love. Addictions, right? So addictions, how does that show up? And that can show up not just as substance abuse issues or substance use issues, but also if we think about how much time are we spending on our phones, right? How much screen time are we engaging in? Anger, right? Do we have disproportionate anger? Is anger showing up often? Are we feeling hypervigilant? Are we engaging? Do we feel numb to the world, right? So this can be, sometimes we're not aware because we're so numb. A loss of hope, a sense of persecution, cynicism, fear, right? These are all ways in which trauma can show up. So when asking yourself, how am I feeling today? How am what are you seeing show up that may indicate that there's some impact, right? There's some impact of the trauma, primary or secondary, that you're experiencing right now. So another self-reflection. My primary or secondary trauma shows up personally and professionally as. So thinking about both subtle and obvious signs. How is it showing up for you? Okay, so I've talked about all this, and I just want everyone to be aware that both in our students and in ourselves, we may lack insight, right? And when we don't have insight into things such as our tendency towards cognitive distortion, it's showing up in our world, but we're not really aware that it's showing up. Sometimes other people are very aware that it's showing up for us, and sometimes we may get feedback to that, and hopefully we're trying to be open, but we may not be aware. If it's really coming from a place of survival behaviors, we need to know that, again, it was adaptive in certain situations, and we get wired, our brain gets wired in a way that it makes sense given what's happened to us, but plasticity in the brain does not happen overnight. Our capacity for changing our cognitive patterns does not happen overnight. So, you know, we have to, again, be kind to ourselves and to our students to understand that it takes time. It takes time, both for them and for us. If we're able to sort of get some insight around the things that we're doing or the way in which trauma is showing up in our own lives, it can really help us engage students with more patience and empathy, right? So even if we just figure out what's causing us to have disproportionate anger in many situations, right? That's going to help me in every interaction I have with my students. The more I walk into my office with a sense of patience, right, the more likely I'm going to be fully present and be able to be empathetic with that student regardless of the context of the situation. So one thing I think it's important for us to understand as we're trying to engage personal development is the therapeutic triad. So you may have used the therapeutic triad in working with students. So again, this can apply to us, right? So well, there are really two areas as we're trying to build resilience. So many of us know a lot about resilience and building resilience skills because that's what we're doing with our students. But sometimes we forget that tied into that are forgiveness and self-compassion. So when you think about your situation, and you look at the therapeutic triad, which of these is most relevant for you, right? So again, this is both personally and professionally. What's happening for me personally is showing up for me professionally. So if I've just gone through a very bitter divorce in which I am having difficulty forgiving my partner, that's going to show up in a lot of different ways. And we may have lots of justification for our anger, for our bitterness. But again, if I am unable to forgive, if I'm unable to forgive abusers, believe it or not, that energy shows up for us, and it shows up for us in negative ways. That's also tied in our capacity for self-compassion. So can I be compassionate to myself for the fact that I have anger, right? And again, anger doesn't always show up as an action that is externalized, right? Sometimes anger is internalized. And so can I just even be nice to myself that I have some anger, and maybe I'm doing some things to myself out of the result of having that anger? And can I be compassionate about this to myself, that I still have something to work on? Again, so asking yourself, which one is most important for positive coping and personal healing? Do I need to work on forgiveness right now? Do I need to work on self-compassion right now? Do I need to engage in some resilience skills? Do I need to go out and do some yoga, engage in some mindfulness? What practices do you already have that can aid in this exploration? Or are there some practices maybe you need to add in, right? So some self-reflection journals, right? Some different, again, if it's just the resilience skills, engaging and all that stuff, exercise that we know helps build resilience, helps with plasticity in the brain. Is there one approach over another that a person seems more open to? So some of us actually, it may be harder for us to engage self-compassion. And so maybe there are certain techniques that work better for you to really begin to think about it, right? To think about those self-compassion skills. So I really have to use voice, right? I have to change up what I refer to as my head tape. What head tape do I have in today? And I have to change that head tape to a loving head tape very frequently. And sometimes I have to actually speak it out loud, right? Not just to run it in my head, that positive head tape, but to say it out loud. So that's something I can do that I'm more open to, right? Sometimes the forgiveness piece is hard, but I needed to reach that space in order to be where I am today, and to not be carrying my trauma in really obvious ways. And all of that has fed into resilience. So again, thinking about the therapeutic triad. When I apply the therapeutic triad in my own life, the areas of focus I most need to work on today are, bad grammar there, are, or the area of focus. So if it's a single one. Oh no, yeah, no, I was right. The area of focus I most need to work on today is, we're focusing on one, but it ties into the others. Okay, so how can we work on self-compassion? Think about someone you admire or whom you would describe as compassionate. What personal qualities stand out about this person? How would you describe this person? What are some other qualities or traits a self-compassionate person might have? Reflect on a situation in which you have experienced compassion for yourself or others. This visualization is really important, right? So we know compassionate people. People have helped us through their compassion. And it is amazing how often we do not become that person for ourselves. So I really encourage you to think about this visualization, and can you be that person for yourself every single day? So again, being self-compassionate is really, really important, and our ability to be self-compassionate actually influences how compassionate we can be to others. The kinder we are to ourselves, typically the kinder we become to others. So we're thinking about this all as it works together, and as we support the self, we are supporting our students. So when we focus on self-awareness, when we think about the ways in which we cognitively distort, when we're engaging those resiliency skills, right? When we engage in self-compassion, this helps us show up and do this work better. It also helps us make sure that we're taking care of the things we need to take care of, such as our mental health challenges. So one final slide here. You know, when we think about how we can promote resilience, so we know that positive connections are key. So how do we reach out, right? How do we reach out to others? How do we get those connections that are going to help us do this work and have more satisfaction, more sense of well-being in our personal and professional lives? How can we engage in relationship skills such as empathy, communication, and conflict management? These are skills we can learn, right? How do we engage coping skills, right? So again, thinking about breathing techniques. If we can engage a breathing technique for ourselves and we have an emotional student in our office, we can also teach that, and we're teaching it from a place in which there's authenticity, right? So it's when we're not engaging our students from a place of authenticity, they sense it, right? They sense it. And then it doesn't really feel like something that's believable. So often we teach things that we don't do ourselves, right? And we're actually not as effective because there's not as much authenticity behind it. So how do you engage your coping skills? Competency, right? So you need to explore your strengths and have opportunities for growth. If you're consistently being asked in your job to engage in areas where you don't have competency and you're not being supported to get those professional development opportunities, right? you really probably shouldn't be engaging that skill, because that's going to affect your self-worth. So where are your strengths, and how can you own those, and how can you discuss those with the people around you to understand, these are my strengths and these are the things I want to be able to engage with frequency, right? We all have some stuff that we're not good at and we have to do. But again, we want to be able to gain competency. Control. We often feel like, right, those fallacies of control. There's a lot of stuff we need to let go of, right? So micromanaging is a sign that we have not let go of control. We need to, in supporting the competencies of other people, the growth of other people, we need to engage in trust, right? That they've given them some opportunities to gain those skills and that they can do it. If we're constantly trying to micromanage, not only does it take up all of our time, but it's a fallacy, right? Things are going to be imperfect. We cannot control everything that happens. So we need to step away. Again, if we really want to do this work well, we're engaging in tolerance for ourselves and others, and letting go of control is part of that. And again, that compassion piece, right? What are you doing to be compassionate towards yourself and others? So this is really the stuff that, if we can engage them for ourselves and not sort of get caught up in, there's not enough time, right? If I want to change my head tape, that just takes seconds, right? So I can do that in my office. That's stuff that isn't taking much time. There are many things that we can do that don't ask us to extend to the point of exhaustion. So I would like to keep all of that in mind as you move forward in doing this important work, because it's so important what you do, and you should value yourself as much as you value your students.
Awesome. That was amazing. I want to say, first of all, I learned a lot of great stuff, and I know our listeners out there did as well. And so as we move into this next question, and answer portion, I just wanted to remind our audience that they can use the control panel to ask their questions. And then I wanted to go ahead, if you're ready, to start off with the first question.
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay, so our first question says, you mentioned limited time as a reason those in helping professions do not engage in self-care. I feel like I'm constantly being asked to do more than I can manage. What can be done about this?
Yeah, this is really hard. So, I mean, again, thinking about how those distortions interplay into your job environment. You know, we do some really important critical work, and we are working with vulnerable populations, but we have to be realistic about what we can do. And frequently when I see individuals really struggling with this, really what has to happen is they really need to work on their own boundaries. So again, both professionally and personally, we need to own what our boundaries are, and we need to tell others what our boundaries are. And we also, again, we need to be able to let go of some of that piece of like, it's only me and only I can take care of this and I can't ask for help. So again, you know, Brene Brown really talks about vulnerability, and it takes some vulnerability sometimes to say, this is my boundary and this is what I need in order to do it. Also, you know, as I mentioned, some of the things that we're talking about here today really don't take much time, right? So if I just, after I've done something, I've made a mistake, I made a mistake on this webinar, if I start to beat myself up, if I say, oh my goodness, I can't believe that I flubbed that sentence, or I sent an email with an error in it, and then I spend time in my head thinking about like my.
One second, I think we're having some technical difficulties.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Yeah, so again, some of those things don't take very long, right? They don't take very long. Just changing my head tape. If I've
And we are out again. So 1 second. Thank you to the audience for being patient with us as we fix these technical issues.
I think I'm back in, but I don't know if it's going to stay.
We're back in. Hopefully it stays.
Hopefully it stays. So I'm not sure what everyone got to hear, but I would say that boundaries are critical. So knowing your boundaries and stating them, and understanding that some of this stuff does not actually take very much time, such as changing out your head tape, right? You can engage in positive self-talk very quickly.
Awesome. And then we're going to move on to the second question we have here. So it says, what can be done to help raise insight into habits like cognitive distortion, not only for our students, but for ourselves?
So, knowledge is key. So really learning what are some of the distortions out there, right? Asking others, right? So if we have problems that are showing up for us consistently, so, I know sometimes that I have some challenges around certain types of management behaviors, for example, that shows up for me consistently. And so I have to be aware, and I have to be open to feedback from others that, hey, there's this way in which you sort of look at those who manage you, right? That potentially is a problem. So not only do I have to learn about what are some different ways in which I maybe engage in thinking patterns that are not serving me personally or professionally, and even with our students, we're engaging them with empathy. Hey, I notice this thing that shows up, and because I care about you and I want to see you succeed, I might be wrong, but I just would like to talk about this. I kind of like to point out that I'm seeing this pattern. So think about it, right? So that's, and it's really the same thing for ourselves. What are we willing to think about around those problems that show up for us consistently, personally and professionally?
Awesome. And then before we read the third question, I do just want to remind our audience that they can also ask questions using the panel. So if you just go to the control panel, you can ask your questions. And with that, I will move on to the third question. So our third question says, I haven't thought much about forgiveness as a tool for building resiliency. Can you talk a bit more about how that ties in?
I think I lost you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so the third question says, I haven't thought much about forgiveness as a tool for building resiliency. Can you talk a bit more about how that ties in?
Yes, anything that we carry in terms of negative emotion, right? So often when we aren't able to move into a place of forgiveness, right, we're holding on to that energy, right? So there's that saying about, is it hate is like drinking poison and hoping the other person will die, right? So we have to really understand that there are many reasons, it takes a long time sometimes to work into forgiveness, but any of that negative energy that we're carrying, so whether that be in an interaction with a student, whether that be in an interaction with a colleague, whether that be in an interaction with a loved one, whenever we're not able to move into a space of forgiveness, we actually are carrying that with us into a place in which we have negative energy. And so, especially when we ruminate around particular interactions and we just get ourselves activated physiologically, psychologically, right? We're not actually moving into a space where we're using that therapeutic triad effectively. So as we can reach for forgiveness and find that, we're reducing all of those physiological, psychological reactions that may be showing up, for example, as a trigger in another situation.
Awesome. So we are about out of time. So I just wanted to thank you again, Dr. Lisa Phoenix, for your time and your amazing webinar. And I wanted to thank all of our listeners out there. And I do wanted to remind the audience that this webinar will be available after on our website. And then last but not least, if you like this content and you want it to continue, you can donate now on our website. And for questions about our webinar series, you can contact Carrie Ward at carrie.j.ward@wmish.edu. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining.